Imagine biting into a dish served at a royal banquet 2,000 years ago only to realize it's something you'd never dream of eating today. Ancient civilizations had tastes that would make even the most adventurous modern foodies pause, from lavish delicacies to everyday meals that reveal surprising truths about how people lived, loved, and even worshipped. Food wasn't just sustenance back then, it was a window into culture, power, and sometimes downright bizarre traditions. And what we're about to uncover will change how you see history's dinner table forever. Think you know what's strange to eat? Wait until you hear about the Roman emperor who feasted on flamingo tongues, or the Mesopotamian brew so thick it had to be sipped through a straw made of gold. These weren't just eccentric choices, they were symbols of status, religion, and even medicine. Every bite tells a story, whether it's the Aztec warriors who relied on chocolate as fuel for battle or the Egyptian pharaohs who believed garlic could summon the gods. The deeper we dig, the more we realize that ancient menus were anything but ordinary. They were daring, inventive, and sometimes downright shocking. This journey isn't just about listing weird foods, it's about uncovering the secrets hidden in recipes carved into clay tablets and scribbled on papyrus. How did a single spice inspire wars? Why did some cultures prize rotten fish as a delicacy? And what forgotten flavors could revolutionize the way we eat today? Over the next 25 stops, we'll explore dishes that defied time, crossed continents, and even shaped empires. So grab a seat at history's most unpredictable feast, because what's coming will surprise, delight, and maybe even make you a little grateful for modern supermarkets. Let's begin. Picture this: a lavish Roman banquet hall, flickering torchlight casting shadows over silver platters piled high with exotic dishes. But one delicacy stands out, something that would make most modern diners push their plates away: roasted dormice. These tiny rodents weren't just an occasional snack for the Roman elite. They were a symbol of wealth, meticulously bred in special clay jars called glararia. Imagine rows of these jars, each one designed to keep the dormice plump and lazy, fattened on acorns and chestnuts until they reached the perfect size for the table. The preparation was anything but simple. Skilled cooks would stuff the dormice with a rich mixture of minced pork, crushed pine nuts, and fragrant spices like peppercorns and garum, a fermented fish sauce the Romans couldn't get enough of. Then they'd roast them whole, basting the tiny carcasses in honey for a glossy, caramelized finish. Served on delicate pottery or even skewered for easy eating, these were finger foods fit for an emperor's guests. Now close your eyes and step into that dining room, the air thick with the scent of sizzling meat and spiced wine. Reclining on cushioned couches, guests would pluck the crispy dormice from trays, laughing as they compared their cook's recipe to rival households. For the Romans, this wasn't just about taste, it was about spectacle, a way to show off their sophistication and access to the rarest ingredients. And in a world where exotic meant power, nothing said, "I've arrived," quite like biting into a honey-glazed rodent at a dinner party. But here's the twist: while we might cringe at the idea today, dormice were more than just a quirky dish. They were part of a culinary tradition that blurred the lines between luxury and necessity. In a time before refrigeration, preserving and flavoring food was an art, and every bite told a story of trade, empire, and even survival. So the next time you see a mouse, just remember 2,000 years ago, it might have been the centerpiece of a feast. And a ticket to social glory. If Romans had a condiment that defined their cuisine, it wasn't olive oil or wine. It was garum, the pungent, umami-rich fish sauce that seeped into nearly every dish they ate. Imagine walking through the back streets of ancient Pompeii, where the air hung thick with the unmistakable scent of rotting fish. That was the smell of industry, massive clay vats lining the coast, filled with layers of salted fish guts left to ferment under the Mediterranean sun for months. The process wasn't for the faint of heart. Workers stirred the bubbling sludge daily, skimming off the clear, amber liquid that rose to the top, the prized garum. The leftover sludge that became a cheaper, thicker sauce called alec slopped onto bread by the poor. This wasn't just a kitchen staple, it was an obsession. Chefs used garum the way we use salt today, drizzling it over roasted meats, mixing it into stews, even pairing it with honey to glaze desserts. Wealthy hosts boasted about their garum's vintage like modern sommeliers, insisting the best came from Spanish mackerel caught in spring. Physicians swore by its healing powers, prescribing it for everything from dog bites to diarrhea. And when Mount Vesuvius erupted, it preserved jars of garum in ash, giving us a snapshot of just how vital this source was to daily life. Now fast forward to today, describe garum to someone and they'll likely recoil at the thought of liquefied fish intestines. But here's the irony, we still crave that same savory punch. Modern fish sauces from Vietnam or Thailand, they're garum's distant cousins, proving the Roman palate wasn't so alien after all. The difference, ancient garum was stronger, more concentrated, a single spoonful could overpower a dish. Yet for all its divisive aroma, it bound the flavors of an empire together, one fermented drop at a time. So next time you reach for Worcestershire sauce or soy sauce, remember, you're dipping into a tradition that once made gladiators cheer and emperors swoon. In the bustling markets of ancient Greece and Rome, no spice commanded as much desire or as steep a price as Silphium. This golden-flowered plant grew only along a narrow strip of Libyan coastline, its thick stalks and heart-shaped seeds becoming so valuable that Julius Caesar kept a stockpile worth 1,500 pounds of silver in Rome's treasury. Merchants traded it like currency, and chefs reserved it for only the wealthiest tables, where its sharp, tangy flavor was said to elevate everything from lamb stews to lentils. But Silphium wasn't just a culinary wonder, it was ancient birth control. Physicians like Hippocrates swore by its contraceptive powers, prescribing tiny doses of its resin dissolved in wine. Some even claimed it could expel unwanted growths, making it the closest thing the classical world had to a morning-after pill. The demand was insatiable. Ships carried whole harvests across the Mediterranean, while poets joked that lovers would sooner give up their sweethearts than part with a vial of Silphium. The plant's heart-shaped seeds became symbols of passion, stamped onto coins and pressed into lovers' hands as tokens. But here's the tragedy, Silphium couldn't be farmed. It thrived only in the wild, its roots clinging stubbornly to Libya's rocky hillsides. Despite royal decrees limiting harvests, every attempt to cultivate it failed. By the 1st century, the fields were stripped bare. Pliny the Elder wrote its final epitaph. The last stalk was given to Emperor Nero as a curiosity, and then it vanished. What's haunting is how modern science echoes these ancient claims. Researchers analyzing related plants like Asafoetida, sometimes called Silphium's cousin, found compounds that may indeed prevent pregnancy. Was Silphium the real deal? We'll never know. But its legacy lingers in that heart symbol on your Valentine's Day card, a silent nod to a flavor, a medicine, and a love story that slipped through history's fingers. Long before modern pharmacies, Europe's apothecaries stocked shelves with remedies that would make today's doctors gasp. None more shocking than powdered mummy, a substance literally ground from ancient Egyptian corpses. This macabre ingredient wasn't some fringe superstition. It was big business. Grave robbers and merchants raided tombs, peeling bandages off millennia-old mummies to hack them into chunks, which were then crushed into fine, rust-colored dust. Wealthy customers paid exorbitant sums for it, believing it could cure everything from headaches to the plague. Physicians mixed it into wine or spread it on wounds, convinced that the preserved flesh held miraculous life force. The irony, many so-called mummies were fakes, dyed animal bones, or even executed criminals dried in the sun to mimic the real thing. Then there was unicorn horn, another sensation of medieval medicine. Sailors returning from Arctic voyages brought back spiraled narwhal tusks, spinning tales of mythical beasts to justify their sky-high prices. Apothecaries shaved flakes into drinks, promising protection against poison, a must-have for paranoid nobles fearing assassination. Kings displayed whole horns as throne room trophies, and a single tusk could buy a castle. The demand was so frantic that when Elizabeth I's royal unicorn horn tested false, it sparked a scandal. What linked these bizarre remedies, fear and status? In an era before science, people clung to anything offering control over death. A noble-sipping mummy-laced wine wasn't just seeking health, he was flaunting his access to the exotic. These weren't medicines, they were power tokens wrapped in myth and desperation. And the darkest truth, long after Europe abandoned them, their legacy lingered in the plundered tombs of pharaohs and the narwhals hunted to near extinction, all for the price of a fairy tale. At the height of medieval Arab hospitality, no dish stunned guests quite like the stuffed camel, a towering spectacle of meat nesting within meat, piled high at the center of feasts celebrating tribal alliances. Picture the scene, a scorching desert night, the air thick with the scent of roasting spices, as servants wheel out a fully cooked camel lying on a bed of rice. But this wasn't just any roast, it was a culinary Russian doll. The camel's hollowed belly held an entire sheep, which in turn was packed with fattened chickens, each of those concealing golden brown fish, their flaky flesh infused with saffron and pomegranate molasses. Preparing this behemoth wasn't just cooking, it was an endurance test. The camel had to be butchered with precision, its ribs carefully separated to create a cavity large enough for the sheep. Layers of spiced rice separated each tier, soaking up the mingling juices as the whole creation slow roasted for days in a pit oven. The result, a symphony of textures. The camel's rich, gamey meat yielding to the sheep's tenderness, then the crisp poultry, and finally the delicate fish, each bite a journey through the hierarchy of flavors. Beyond its shock value, this dish was diplomacy on a platter. For Bedouin tribes, hosting such a feast signaled not just wealth but trust. The labor alone requiring dozens of cooks and rare ingredients like pistachios and dried limes proved the host's commitment to the alliance. Guests would tear into the meat with their hands, sharing strips of camel as vows of loyalty were sworn over cups of spiced coffee. What's fascinating is how the dish mirrored the social order. Just as the camel encased smaller animals, the tribal chief presided over the feast, portioning out meat according to status. The fish, hidden deepest, were treasures for honored elders, a subtle nod to wisdom lying beneath layers of strength. Today, the dish survives only in legends, but its spirit lives on in modern Arab cuisine's love of layered, communal meals. So next time you see a turducken, remember, it's just the echo of a time when feasts were mountains of meat and every bite sealed a promise. In medieval Europe, where feasts were theater and every dish told a story, few spectacles dazzled guests like a roasted peacock, its iridescent plumage perfectly intact despite being cooked to perfection. The preparation was a masterpiece of illusion. First, the bird was carefully skinned, its feathers meticulously plucked and set aside like precious fabric. The tough, sinewy meat, far from tender, was then rubbed with a paste of ginger, cloves, and saffron, spices expensive enough to mask its gaminess. Once roasted, the real artistry began. Cooks would stitch the skin back onto the meat, arranging the feathers in their original splendor, even propping the head upright with wires to mimic the bird's haughty posture. Some hosts went further, placing a soaked cotton wad in the beak so servants could light it aflame before carrying the dish into the hall, the peacock glowing like a mythical creature as cheers erupted from the tables. This wasn't just dinner, it was a power move. Peacocks symbolized immortality and pride, their images emblazoned on noble coats of arms. Serving one whole sent a clear message: the host's wealth could transform even the toughest meat into a luxury. The bird's tail fanned out like a crown, a silent boast of the kitchen's skill and the family's rich spices from the east, feathers traded from the Levant. And there was an unspoken rule: no one dared carve the peacock first. It would circle the room as a centerpiece until the highest-ranking guest took the honor, slicing into the golden skin to reveal the fiery spices beneath. But beneath the glittering performance lay a darker truth. Peacock meat was notoriously unappetizing, described by one medieval scribe as chewy as saddle leather. The spices weren't just for flavor, they were a necessity, overwhelming the palate to distract from the bird's natural toughness. Even the feathers were a gamble. If stored damp, they'd mold. If dried too long, they'd crumble. Yet families bankrupted themselves to serve these avian monuments, all for that gasp of wonder when the platter entered the room. Today, the practice seems absurd, but its legacy lingers in how we plate food, celebrating visuals over taste, spectacle over substance. Next time you see a chef painstakingly garnish a dish, remember, they're heirs to a tradition where a bird's resurrection mattered more than its flavor. And if you think food styling is a modern obsession, medieval nobles were staging Instagram-worthy feasts centuries before the camera existed. In the sweltering heat of ancient Egypt's date orchards, a curious alchemy unfolded, one that turned sweat, saliva, and fruit into a prized elixir known as maiden's vinegar. Picture rows of young girls, barefoot and robed in linen, climbing palm trees to harvest the sweetest dates. But instead of simply eating or selling them, these fruits underwent a ritual as precise as it was peculiar. The girls would chew each date deliberately, mixing the pulp with enzymes in their saliva before spitting the mash into clay jars. Left to ferment in the blistering sun, the mixture would bubble and sour, transforming into a tangy, amber-hued vinegar coveted by pharaohs and physicians alike. This wasn't just a quirky kitchen hack, it was biochemistry in action. The girls' saliva contained amylase, an enzyme that broke down the date's starches into sugars, jump-starting fermentation. The sweat on their hands, rich in salts and minerals, further seasoned the brew, creating a complex flavor profile that modern science has only recently decoded. Wealthy Egyptians used it as both a condiment and medicine, believing it could purify blood and aid digestion. Temples stocked it for rituals, and nobles sipped it diluted in water as a refreshing tonic. But here's the twist: the maidens themselves rarely tasted the finished product. Their labor was invisible, their contributions reduced to whispers in the shadows of palace kitchens. The divide between creator and consumer spoke volumes about Egyptian society. While the elite savored maidens' vinegar at banquets, drizzling it over roasted duck or figs, the girls who made it were often from lower castes, their work dismissed as mere tradition. Yet without their precise technique, the right chew, the perfect spit, the vinegar would fail. It was a paradox, a delicacy born from the humblest acts, celebrated by those who'd never dirty their hands making it. Today, we'd recoil at the thought of drinking something fermented with spit. But modern chefs are rediscovering the magic of human-driven fermentation, from Japanese sake brewed with koji-chewing laborers to Amazonian chicha made the same way. Maiden's vinegar wasn't just a food, it was a testament to how necessity and ingenuity collide, turning something as simple as a chewed date into a flavor that shaped an empire's palate. And if that doesn't make you appreciate your grocery store balsamic, nothing will. Among the warriors of Sparta, where strength was currency and weakness unthinkable, there was one dish that defined their harsh existence: black broth. This murky gruel, simmered in iron cauldrons across military barracks, wasn't just food, it was a test of endurance. Picture a thick, greasy sludge of boiled pork legs, their fat left to congeal, mixed with vinegar so sharp it made the throat burn, and just enough pig's blood to stain the broth a sinister shade of black. No herbs, no salt, just a punishing combination of iron-rich blood and sour vinegar, designed not to please the palate but to harden it. When visitors from other Greek city-states dared to taste it, their reactions bordered on horror. One Athenian, after a single spoonful, reportedly muttered, Now I understand why Spartans feared death so little. Life with this broth is punishment enough. But that was the point. For Spartans, luxury was the enemy, and black broth was their culinary shield against softness. Boys in the agoge, Sparta's brutal training program, were given nothing else during their grueling drills, teaching them to subsist on the barest sustenance. Even kings ate it in the communal mess halls, proof that no one, not even the elite, could escape its harsh embrace. The irony, this reviled dish was surprisingly nutritious. The pork fat provided energy for marathon training sessions, the blood packed with protein to rebuild muscle, and the vinegar acted as a primitive preservative and possibly even guarded against scurvy. Modern recreations suggest it might have tasted like a ferocious, primal version of French blood sausage or British black pudding, but without any spices to tame its brutality. What fascinates historians isn't just the broth itself, but the psychology behind it. While Athenians nibbled honey cakes and debated philosophy, Spartans weaponized their cuisine, turning every meal into a reminder comfort was for the weak. The black broth wasn't just sustenance, it was propaganda in a pot, a daily reaffirmation that Spartans were different, harder, unbreakable. Today, you won't find it on any Greek menu, but its spirit lingers in extreme diets from military rations to ultra-athlete regimens. So next time you wince at a health food trend, remember Spartans were the original influencers, and their black broth was the ultimate flex. High in the Andes, where the air thins and the sun burns fierce, the Inca Empire brewed a sacred drink that blurred the line between food, art, and worship: chicha. Picture women gathered in stone-lined courtyards, their mouths working tirelessly as they chewed dried corn kernels, softening them before spitting the pulp into clay vats. This wasn't crude behavior, it was science in motion. Their saliva, rich in enzymes, broke down the corn starches into fermentable sugars, kickstarting a process that would yield a tangy, slightly fizzy beer within days. The result, a golden, cloudy brew with a sour punch, drunk from intricately carved wooden cups during festivals, weddings, and even before battle. For the Inca, chicha was far more than a beverage. It was a bridge to the gods. Priests offered it to Pachamama, the earth goddess, pouring libations into the soil before planting crops. Emperors distributed it as a political tool. Shared chicha meant loyalty, while refusing a cup could spark wars. The drink's role was so vital that chicha maidens, chosen for their skill and purity, lived in temples dedicated solely to its production. These women followed strict rituals, fasting before chewing and avoiding spicy foods that might alter the flavor. Their labor was considered sacred, their spit transformed into something divine. The fermentation process itself was a marvel. Unlike European beers reliant on malted grains, chicha's magic came from human biology. After chewing, the corn mash was left to ferment in open-air vats, where wild yeast from the highland air worked alongside the enzymes. The best batches had a subtle sweetness, balancing the sourness, and were strained through woven cloth to remove hulls. Some varieties were aged in sealed jars for months, developing a potency that could leave celebrants stumbling. A detail Spanish conquistadors noted with both horror and reluctant admiration. Today, chicha lives on in Andean villages, though modern versions often skip the chewing step, using malted corn or added yeast instead. But in places like Cusco or sacred valleys of Peru, traditional brewers still honor the old ways, their chicha served in roadside taverns marked by red flags. The drink's legacy even echoes in slang. When Peruvians say something is shaver, cool, they're invoking the Quechua word for chicha. What's striking is how this ancient practice foreshadowed modern fermentation science. From Japanese sake to Amazonian koim, humans have long harnessed saliva's power to transform food. Chicha wasn't just about intoxication, it was chemistry, community, and conquest in a cup. So next time you sip a craft beer, remember its origins might be far humbler and far more human than you'd ever guess. In Roman banquet halls, where culinary creativity knew no bounds, one dessert carried a name that still raises eyebrows today: placenta cake. Before you grimace, this ancient delicacy had nothing to do with the organ we associate with childbirth. Instead, its name came from the Greek plakos, meaning flat or layered, a nod to its intricate construction. Picture thin sheets of dough painstakingly stretched until translucent, then layered with creamy ricotta-like cheese, crushed nuts, and rivers of honey. Baked until golden, it emerged as a cross between baklava and cheesecake, a sweet, sticky masterpiece that crackled with each bite. This wasn't just a treat, it was a centerpiece of religious festivals, particularly those honoring Juno, the goddess of motherhood. Families would offer placenta cakes at temples, symbolizing fertility and abundance. The layers represented the stages of life, while the honey, a luxury item, signified divine favor. Recipes survive in the writings of Cotto the Elder, who detailed the precise technique: dough made from spelt flour, cheese blended with bay leaves for aroma, and a final drizzle of honey infused with saffron. The result was so revered that slaves caught stealing scraps of it could face harsh punishments. The irony: modern misconceptions have overshadowed its true legacy. Thanks to its name, many assume it was tied to postpartum rituals, but no historical evidence supports this. The cake's connection to childbirth was purely symbolic, a celebration of life's sweetness rather than a literal ingredient. What's fascinating is how closely it resembles desserts we love today. Take Italian cannoli or Greek galactobarico, both heirs to this ancient tradition of layered dough, cheese, and honey. Yet the placenta cake's real magic lay in its duality. It was both humble and extravagant, made from pantry staples yet elevated to sacred status. In a society where food mirrored social order, this dish bridged classes simple enough for farmers to replicate yet lavish enough for patricians to flaunt. Its layers told a story of Rome itself: sturdy foundations, rich interiors, and a golden finish that left everyone craving more. So next time you slice into a cheesecake, remember, you're tasting a legacy that once graced the altars of gods and the tables of emperors, one sweet layer at a time. Along the frost-laced shores of Viking-age Scandinavia, where few crops dared grow, the sea wasn't just a source of food, it was a royal larder. And among its treasures, one delicacy stood above the rest: whale tongue. Picture a Norse chieftain's feast, the longhouse roaring with laughter and firelight, as servants hauled in a massive grey lump glistening with fat. This wasn't just meat, it was a Viking status symbol carved from the sea's mightiest beast. The tongue, sometimes weighing as much as a grown man, was sliced into thick, buttery strips, its rich marbling prized like edible gold. But here's where modern palates might recoil: some preferred it rotten. Preservation was an art in the Viking world, where winters stretched endlessly and fresh spoils were rare. Whale tongue, already dense with fat, was often buried in wooden casks or pits lined with birch bark, left to ferment for months until it developed a pungent, ammonia-laced kick akin to Iceland's infamous hakal. This wasn't mere preference, it was survival chemistry. The fermentation process broke down the meat's toxins, making it safer to eat, while the intense flavor masked any spoilage, a practical solution in an era before salt was plentiful. Yet for the elite, eating it was a flex. A chief serving rotten whale tongue wasn't just offering food. He was proving his wealth could stretch beyond necessity, that his stores were so vast he could let meat age to perfection. The dish's preparation was steeped in ritual. Sagas describe how the tongue was reserved for victorious warriors or sealed alliances, its richness a metaphor for the bounty a strong leader could provide. Skalds even wove verses comparing its texture to the silken waves of Freyja's hair, a nod to its mythical stature. And while commoners might taste whale blubber or dried flesh, the tongue was always for the high table, a culinary crown only the powerful could afford. Beneath the spectacle lay darker truths. Whales were hunted with harpoons and nets, their carcasses hauled onto skerries with ropes of braided horsehair. Entire villages might feast for weeks off a single catch, but the tongue was never shared equally. Its distribution mirrored Viking society itself, hierarchical, ruthless, and steeped in symbolism. Today, the closest echo of this practice survives in Iceland, where Hakal fermented shark still divides adventurous eaters, but whale tongue itself has vanished from menus, a victim of shifting tastes and conservation ethics. Yet its legacy lingers in Nordic cuisine's love of bold, preserved flavors from lutefisk to surströmming. So the next time you spread butter on toast, remember, 1,000 years ago, that simple act of enjoying fat would have been a luxury worthy of a saga. The waters off ancient Greece shimmered with a paradox: dolphins, beloved companions of sailors and sacred to Poseidon, yet hunted ruthlessly for their rich, dark meat. Temples might depict these creatures as divine messengers, their sleek forms carved into marble alongside tridents and waves, but in coastal villages, dolphin bones piled up in kitchen middens, cracked open for marrow or charred from roasting. Archaeologists sifting through these refuse heaps find the evidence: vertebrae sliced clean by knives, skulls bearing telltale marks of butchery. How did a culture that revered dolphins also feast on them? The answer lies in the brutal calculus of survival. For fishermen battling the Aegean's whims, dolphins were both rivals and resources. They stole catches from nets, yes, but their blubber rendered into oil for lamps, their flesh protein rich and fatty, a rare luxury in diets heavy on barley and olives. Homer's Odyssey hints at this duality, describing fishermen who rejoice at dolphins driven ashore, even as myth celebrated them rescuing shipwrecked poets. The contradiction wasn't lost on the Greeks. Some city-states like Miletus imposed fines for killing dolphins, while others turned a blind eye when stocks of tuna dwindled. The preparation was pragmatic. Dolphin meat, tougher than fish but richer, was often salt-cured or stewed with pungent herbs like Silphium to mask its gamey intensity. Wealthy households might serve it grilled with a glaze of figs, while the poor boiled it into broth stretched with lentils. Yet even as it fed families, the act carried unease. Fishermen whispered of storms that followed a hunt, of nets mysteriously slashed, omens blamed on Poseidon's wrath. What's haunting is how modern excavations reveal glimpses of this cognitive dissonance. At the sanctuary of Apollo in Delphi, dolphin figurines sit near altars, while just outside the gates, trash pits hold their bones. The Greeks didn't resolve the tension. They lived with it, honoring dolphins as gods one day, eating them the next. Today, the practice shocks us, but it's a stark reminder. Ancient survival rarely fit neatly into myths, and perhaps that's the most human lesson of all. That reverence and hunger could share the same table under the same watchful eyes of the gods. Along the banks of the Nile, where the water shimmered under the relentless sun, the blue lotus flower floated like a jewel on the river's surface. To the ancient Egyptians, these blossoms were far more than decoration. They were portals to the divine. Priests and pharaohs alike steeped the petals in wine, creating a ruby-hued elixir that blurred the line between banquet and ritual. With each sip, the drinker would feel warmth spread through their limbs, visions dancing at the edges of sight as the flower's psychoactive compounds took hold. This wasn't mere intoxication. It was communion with the gods, a sacred tradition depicted in tomb paintings where figures hold lotus cups to their lips, their eyes half-lidded in ecstasy. The effects were deliberate. Modern analysis reveals the blue lotus contains apomorphine, a compound that induces euphoria and vivid hallucinations. Temples used it to induce trances during ceremonies honoring Hathor, the goddess of joy and oblivion. But the lotus also had a darker edge. Scrolls from the reign of Akhenaten warn against overindulgence, describing nobles who lost days in a haze, their minds adrift like boats untethered from the shore. The line between spiritual tool and vice was thin, a duality the Greeks would later immortalize in Homer's Odyssey. When Odysseus' crew stumbles upon the lotus eaters, their fate mirrors Egypt's conflicted relationship with the flower. Homer describes a people lost in bliss, content to graze on the narcotic plant forever, their memories of home dissolving like honey in wine. The parallels are uncanny. Just as the lotus eater's island saps ambition, Egyptian texts speak of courtiers who neglected duties after partaking too deeply. Yet, unlike Homer's cautionary tale, Egypt embraced the paradox. The same pharaohs who regulated lotus wine stocked their burial chambers with garlands of dried blooms, a promise that death itself would be a waking dream. Archaeology offers eerie confirmation. Jars labeled lotus wine have been found in royal tombs, their residues still potent enough to identify the alkaloids within. And in the ruins of a Theban pharmacy, a recipe scratched on papyrus details how to amplify the flower's effects by mixing it with mandrake and poppy, an ancient cocktail for transcending reality. What fascinates most is how the lotus transcends time. Today, you'll find it marketed as a legal high, its dried petals sold online for modern seekers of altered states. Yet the allure remains unchanged, a flower that promises to dissolve borders, whether between mortal and divine, past and present, or sobriety and dream. The blue lotus wasn't just a drug or a sacrament, it was a mirror reflecting humanity's eternal hunger to slip the bonds of the ordinary, one petal at a time. In the candlelit halls of Tudor England, where feasts were theatre and extravagance knew no bounds, few dishes shocked guests quite like parrot pie. Picture a golden, flaky crust carried aloft by servants, steam rising as the pie was set before a noble audience. Then the moment everyone waited for the top crust would burst open and live parrots, their feathers aflame with tropical color, would erupt from the dish in a flurry of wings and squawks. This wasn't just culinary spectacle, it was a macabre party trick designed to awe wealthy guests with the host's access to the exotic. The birds, imported at staggering cost from the New World or Africa, were sometimes even trained to mimic courtly phrases, adding to the illusion that they'd emerged unscathed. But the truth was darker. Many parrots, trapped in the stifling heat of the oven as the crust baked around them, suffocated before the grand reveal, their brilliant plumage the only untouched remnant of their ordeal. The paradox of this cruelty, Tudor society held deep superstitions about birds as vessels for the dead. Folk tales spoke of sparrows carrying departed souls, and magpies were omens of both fortune and doom. Even parrots, with their uncanny ability to mimic human speech, were sometimes seen as messengers between worlds, creatures that could bridge the veil. Yet here they were, baked into pies for a moment's gasping delight. The disconnect speaks volumes about the era's contradictions, a culture that reverenced the spiritual yet reveled in displays of dominance over nature. Recipes from the period reveal the callous precision behind these surprise pies. Cooks would craft a false bottom in the pastry where the live birds were hidden while the real filling, often a mix of minced meat and dried fruit, sat beneath. The oven's heat was carefully controlled to warm but not kill the parrots, though mistakes were common. One account describes a banquet where the birds, disoriented by heat, flew into candle flames, their shrieks cutting through the music. What's striking is how the practice mirrored Tudor power dynamics. Just as the aristocracy displayed wealth through wasteful extravagance, gilding food with gold leaf or sculpting sugar into elaborate tableaus, parrot pies were edible propaganda. They screamed, "I command resources you can't fathom," a flex that extended beyond taste, and the birds themselves, mere props in a performance of dominance, their vibrancy extinguished for a single night's applause. Yet even then, whispers of unease lingered. Naturalists like William Turner condemned the practice as unseemly, while clergy muttered about the sin of squandering God's creatures. The backlash wasn't about cruelty to animals, a concept barely understood, but about imbalance. If birds carried souls, what did it mean to roast them for sport? The pies gradually fell from fashion, replaced by tamer spectacles like marzipan models or 4 and 20 blackbirds, which by Elizabethan times were usually baked dead. Today, the legacy of parrot pie survives in idioms like eating humble pie, and in our modern obsession with viral food stunts, think exploding cakes or gold leaf desserts. The difference: our spectacles don't hinge on literal suffering, but the impulse remains to astonish, to dominate, to turn food into theater. And perhaps that's the most lasting lesson of these grotesque delicacies, that humanity's appetite for wonder has always been and will always be as complex as it is insatiable. In the shadow of Rome's marble palaces, where power was measured in spectacle, Emperor Elagabalus turned dining into a blood sport, one where the smallest creatures paid the highest price. Take the humble songbird, no larger than a fig, snatched from Mediterranean skies by the thousands. These weren't just snacks, they were edible propaganda. Picture bronze frying pans sizzling with dozens of sparrows, thrushes, and finches, their delicate bones crisped to golden perfection. Guests would pop them into their mouths whole, crunching through skulls and wings in a single bite, the rich fat of their tiny bodies bursting like grapes. But the true horror wasn't the act of eating them, it was the waste. Historians like Dio Cassius described tables groaning under mountains of fried birds, most left uneaten, their carcasses swept into the gutter like discarded olive pits. This wasn't gluttony, it was performance art. Elagabalus, the teenage emperor infamous for his decadence, understood that excess could intimidate. By serving 100 birds where one would suffice, he demonstrated control over life itself. How easily something vibrant could be reduced to a greasy afterthought. The message to senators and rivals was clear: this is what I do to tiny creatures, imagine what I'll do to you. Then came the flamingo tongues. At certain feasts, servants would parade in with silver platters bearing nothing but the delicately sliced tongues of hundreds of flamingos, each bird slaughtered for a single mouthful. The tongues, dyed pink from their shrimp-rich diet, were tossed with garum and peppercorns, their texture akin to fine scallops, but their rarity was the point. Flamingos weren't just hunted, they were captured alive, marched to Rome in cages to keep their muscles tender, then butchered fresh, the rest of the bird often tossed to dogs. What's chilling is how meticulously these acts were staged. Elagabalus didn't just serve flamingo tongues, he served them colder than the others to prove they'd been shipped on ice from Alexandria, a logistical nightmare in August heat. He didn't just fry songbirds, he imported them from as far as Gaul to show his reach extended beyond taste, beyond reason. Yet beneath the theater lay a grim irony. While Rome's poor scrabbled for grain, the elite gorged on creatures that symbolized freedom, birds that could fly beyond empire's grasp, only to be plucked from the sky. The historian Suetonius sneered that such feasts were the empire's death rattle, a sign that Rome had forgotten the very discipline that built it. Today, echoes of this excess linger in dishes like ortolan bunting, the French delicacy where songbirds are drowned in brandy and eaten under napkins to hide the act from God. But Elagabalus' true legacy isn't culinary, it's the reminder that when food becomes a weapon, even the most beautiful things can be devoured without a second thought. On the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, where the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan once rose like a mirage, a delicacy so precious it was reserved for emperors still hides in plain sight: ahuatl, the insect caviar of the Americas. Picture nets skimming the lake's surface at dawn, gathering clusters of tiny, pearl-like eggs laid by waterflies. These weren't just snacks, they were a powerhouse of nutrition, packed with more protein than beef and rich in amino acids, a fact modern science has only recently confirmed. The Aztecs called them the corn of the water, a poetic nod to their role as a staple that sustained armies and fed festivals honoring Tlaloc, the rain god. The preparation was meticulous. Harvesters would lay reeds or straw mats on the lake, luring the flies to lay their eggs in dense, harvestable clumps. Once collected, the eggs were rinsed and then toasted on clay comals until they popped like minuscule popcorn, releasing a nutty, earthy aroma. Served with chili-infused tomato sauce or folded into tamales, ahuatl had a texture somewhere between quinoa and fish roe, a delicate crunch giving way to a buttery richness. Spanish conquistadors, recoiling at the idea of eating insect eggs, dismissed it as poor man's food, but Montezuma's chefs knew better. They served it alongside axolotl salamanders and chocolate, a trio of indigenous luxuries that symbolized the empire's mastery over land, water, and sky. Today, the tradition survives in the markets of Mexico City, where ahuatl is now dubbed Mexican caviar and sells for prices that rival the sturgeon variety. But here's the twist: this ancient food might hold the key to a modern crisis. With global fisheries collapsing and beef production straining the planet, scientists are eyeing insect-based proteins as a sustainable alternative. The Aztecs, it turns out, were centuries ahead of the curve. Ahuatl requires no farmland, negligible water, and leaves a carbon footprint smaller than a fly's wing. Yet the real challenge isn't ecological, it's cultural. Will the world overcome its bias against bugs to embrace what the Aztecs celebrated? In Oaxaca, chefs are already bridging the gap, serving ahuatl risottos or dusting it over artisanal tortillas as a gourmet garnish. The irony is delicious. A food once scorned by colonizers now stars in high-end cuisine, a quiet reclamation of heritage. So next time you fret over future food shortages, remember the answer might be floating on a lake, waiting for nets to gather it, just as they did when Tenochtitlan's canals glittered under the sun. In the sun-baked courtyards of Mesopotamia, where civilization first learned to write its dreams onto clay, there was one food so essential it blurred the line between meal and drink: beer bread. This dense, crumbly loaf wasn't just sustenance, it was the edible foundation of society, baked with the very same fermented grains that filled tavern steins. Imagine a bread so infused with ale it crumbled like wet sand, its pores swollen with the tang of ancient yeast. But here's the twist: this wasn't eaten the way we'd expect. Instead of biting into it, Mesopotamians would tear off chunks and drop them into jars of fresh beer, letting the bread dissolve into a thick, porridge-like sludge. Then they'd sip the mixture through long straws of gold or reed, filtering out the bitter sediment collected at the bottom, a practice immortalized in stone carvings where banqueters recline with straws plunged into communal vessels. The recipe survives today, etched into 4,000-year-old cuneiform tablets like the famous hymn to Ninkasi, a ode to the goddess of beer that doubles as brewing instructions. Barley was malted by soaking and drying, then mixed with dates for sweetness and baked twice, once to ferment the dough, then again to stabilize it. The result was bread so potent it could be stored for months, a portable feast for soldiers and merchants crossing the desert. Archaeologists even found traces of this bread in the ruins of Ur, its charred remains still clinging to the inside of clay ovens. But this wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Beer bread featured in temple offerings, its crumbles symbolizing the body of the earth, while the beer it flavored represented the lifeblood of rivers. Workers building the ziggurats were paid in daily rations of both, fueling the construction of wonders with every sticky, fermented bite. Modern recreations reveal a flavor profile closer to sourdough meets oatmeal stout, with a chewy crust giving way to a moist, yeasty interior. The true genius lay in its duality. In a world without forks or fine sieves, beer bread was nature's perfect filter, a spoon, a thickener, and a meal all in one. And those straws, they weren't just tools, they were status symbols. Commoners used reeds, while kings sipped through lapis lazuli tubes inlaid with precious stones. Every element, from bread to straw, whispered secrets about who you were in the world's first great cities. Today, the legacy lingers in unlikely places. Ethiopian tej, a honeyed beer drunk with spongy injera bread, echoes the same marriage of solid and liquid. Even our phrase, breaking bread, might trace back to Mesopotamian sharing rituals where a crumbled loaf meant fellowship. So next time you dunk a crust into your stout, remember, you're reenacting a 6,000-year-old tradition, one that turned simple grains into the mortar of empires. In a quiet kitchen in Pompeii, far from the roaring crowds of ancient Rome's banquet halls, a group of archaeologists and chefs gather around a clay pot, one that hasn't held a dormouse in nearly 2,000 years. Today, they're attempting the impossible, bringing this controversial delicacy back to life. The challenge: no original recipe survives intact. All they have are scattered clues, fragments of texts mentioning glararia jars, carbonized remains of pine nuts in ancient middens, and murals depicting plump rodents basted in honey. So the team starts with what they know: the dormice must be fattened first. They replicate the clay jars, stuffing them with straw and filling feeding trays with walnuts and figs, just as the Romans did. But there's a catch: modern dormice, a protected species in Europe, can't be used. Instead, they substitute a close relative, the edible dormouse of Slovenia, still hunted there legally today. The first hurdle is flavor. Ancient texts describe the meat as rich and gamey, closer to rabbit but with a distinct muskiness from the rodent's diet of acorns. To match this, the chefs brine the dormice in a homemade garum, fermented anchovies and herbs, then stuff them with minced pork shoulder, crushed almonds, and a controversial addition: a dash of lovage, an herb some scholars swear was the secret ingredient in elite Roman kitchens. As the tiny carcasses roast, the kitchen fills with a scent that's equal parts intriguing and unsettling: caramelized honey cut through with a funky, earthy aroma. Then comes the tasting. A historian from Cambridge who spent years studying Roman feasting rituals hesitates before taking a bite. The texture is unexpected, she admits, chewing slowly, like quail but denser, and that aftertaste: there's a sourness I can't place. Another taster, a Naples-born chef, disagrees. No, the honey's too light. Romans would have used defrutum, grape syrup, boiled down until it's almost black. That's what gives the depth. The debate echoes through food history circles. Some argue the Romans preferred their dormice barely cooked, served pink to showcase freshness. Others insist they were slow roasted until the bones crumbled, a technique that would have tenderized the notoriously tough meat. Then there's the garum question. We've been too cautious, argues a Roman cuisine specialist. Their garum was far stronger than anything we dare make today. Imagine fish sauce aged for a year, not a month, something that could strip the enamel off your teeth. That's what would have balanced the sweetness. What's revealing is how these recreations expose our modern biases. Many testers expect the dish to be repulsive, but those who brave the first bite often describe something surprisingly familiar: a cross between pulled pork and duck confit with a sticky, sweet glaze. The real barrier isn't the taste, it's the idea of eating rodent. As one participant puts it, "If you called this honey-glazed field mouse, I'd gag." But serve it as ancient Roman delicacy and suddenly it's archaeology. Perhaps the most telling moment comes when a chef suggests wrapping the dormouse in pancetta before roasting, a modern hack to add fat. The historians bristle. That's not authentic, one protests, but then a quiet voice pipes up from the back. And how do we know the Romans didn't do the same? Maybe they wrapped theirs in cured so's belly and just never wrote it down. The room falls silent. After all, history only records what someone thought was worth preserving. The rest, like the true taste of a dormouse feast, might be lost to time, waiting for the next brave soul to take a bite and wonder. The pungent aroma of fermenting fish that once wafted through Roman ports didn't vanish with the empire. It sailed east, evolving into the backbone of Southeast Asia's most iconic flavors. Take a stroll through the coastal villages of Phu Quoc in Vietnam, where wooden barrels of nuoc mam ferment under the tropical sun, and you'll witness garum's reincarnation. The process is eerily familiar. Layers of anchovies packed with salt, left to break down for months until the liquid gold rises to the top. But where Roman garum was a one-note umami bomb, Newark mam dances with complexity, its flavor deepened by the region's unique blend of warm waters and monsoon humidity. Artisans guard their fermentation timelines like state secrets, with premium batches aged up to 3 years in century-old vats, the fish proteins transforming into amino acids that linger on the tongue like liquid velvet. Cross the border into Thailand and Nam Pla takes the tradition further. Here, the sauce isn't just a condiment, it's the soul of dishes like pad thai and tom yum. The Thai method introduces a microbial twist. Some producers add roasted rice or palm sugar to the fermenting vats, encouraging wild yeasts that lend a subtle sweetness absent in Roman recipes. This isn't mere preservation, it's alchemy. The enzymes from the fish guts, once discarded by squeamish modern cooks, work in concert with tropical microbes to create flavors no lab could replicate. In ancient Rome, garum was a blunt instrument. In Southeast Asia, it became a scalpel, slicing through dishes with surgical precision. What connects these traditions across 2 millennia and thousands of miles? Necessity and ingenuity. Just as Roman sailors needed protein that wouldn't spoil, Vietnamese fishermen relied on nuoc mam to sustain them through monsoon seasons when fresh catches were scarce. Both cultures discovered that fermentation wasn't just about survival, it was a way to coax magic from decay. The difference lies in the details. While Romans favored mackerel for its oil content, Southeast Asians leaned toward smaller fish like anchovies, their higher bone-to-flesh ratio contributing to the sauce's minerality. And where garum was often diluted with wine or vinegar, nuoc mam meets lime juice and chili in the iconic dipping sauce nuoc cham, a bright counterpoint to its funky depths. Modern science reveals why these sauces feel so addictive. They're packed with glutamate's natural compounds that trigger our umami receptors, but each culture's environment stamps its signature. The warmer waters of Southeast Asia host different plankton species than the Mediterranean, imparting distinct amino acid profiles to the fish. Even the salt matters. Roman garum used coarse sea salt harvested from evaporating pools, while Thai Nam Pla often employs rock salt with trace minerals that alter fermentation kinetics. The legacy is most poignant in family-run operations. In the Vietnamese village of Nam O, generations have tended the same wooden vats since the 15th century. Their methods barely changed from when Roman ships still dotted the horizon. They'll tell you their best batches come from the rainy season, when atmospheric pressure affects the fermentation rate, a nuance no ancient text ever recorded. It's living proof that some culinary wisdom transcends parchment and ink, passed instead through hands that stir the vats and noses that know when the brew is ready. So the next time you drizzle fish sauce over a steaming bowl of pho, remember, you're not just tasting Vietnam. You're sipping the distilled essence of a technique that fueled legions, crossed oceans, and survived the fall of empires. The jars may look different and the flavors may have evolved, but the alchemy remains the same: salt, time, and the fearless human instinct to transform the unlikeliest ingredients into something extraordinary. For centuries, Silphium was thought to be lost forever until a team of botanists hiking the steep cliffs of Turkey's Mount Hassan in 2023 spotted a flash of yellow. There, clinging stubbornly to the rocky slopes, grew a wildflower with heart-shaped seed pods and thick, ricinous stalks, a plant bearing uncanny resemblance to ancient descriptions of Silphium. The discovery sent shockwaves through the botanical community. Could this be a surviving relative of history's most mysterious spice? Genetic testing revealed a striking truth. While not identical to the original Silphium of Cyrene, this plant, classified as Ferula drudina, shared enough chemical markers to suggest a shared lineage. Its resin contained compounds with both contraceptive and anti-inflammatory properties, echoing the very traits that made Silphium so valuable to the Romans. But the real breakthrough came when researchers turned their attention to North Africa, Silphium's original homeland. satellite imaging and drone surveys of Libya's Jabal al-Akhdar region, the same mountains where Silphium once thrived, uncovered patches of Ferula tingitana, a rare cousin with similar medicinal uses. Local Berber tribes had long harvested its sap as a digestive aid, unaware of its connection to the legendary plant that once funded their ancestors' cities. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Chemical analysis showed these modern plants produced a tangy, celery-like aroma when crushed, matching ancient texts that described Silphium's sharp, herbal scent. Yet the most tantalizing clue came from an unexpected source: kitchen traditions. In remote Tunisian villages, elders still prepare a traditional remedy by steeping the dried roots of a local ferula species in olive oil, a practice strikingly similar to Pliny the Elder's notes on Silphium-based tonics. When scientists sampled these preparations, they identified compounds that could inhibit bacterial growth, lending credence to Roman claims of the plant's healing powers. The hunt now hinges on a race against time. Climate change and overgrazing threaten these last remnants of Silphium's family, with some populations dwindling to fewer than 50 plants. Conservationists are working with local communities to protect the remaining patches, while seed banks scramble to preserve genetic material. Some researchers even speculate that selective breeding of these rediscovered relatives could one day resurrect something close to the original Silphium, though its exact flavor and potency may remain forever shrouded in mystery. What's clear is that Silphium never truly vanished. It simply retreated into the margins, waiting for those persistent enough to seek it. And as modern science catches up with ancient wisdom, we're left to wonder how many other forgotten treasures might still be hiding in plain sight, their secrets buried not in lost scrolls, but in the stubborn roots of plants that refuse to die. The Spartan black broth wasn't just a meal, it was a manifesto swallowed one bitter spoonful at a time. While modern diet gurus preach superfoods for longevity, the Spartans weaponized nutrition, crafting a dish that embodied their entire philosophy: discomfort as discipline. Picture a society where boys as young as 7 were torn from their mothers and plunged into the agoge, a training regime so brutal it made modern boot camps seem leisurely. Their reward for surviving a day of wrestling in freezing rivers or stealing food to avoid starvation: a bowl of lukewarm broth so repulsive that even other Greeks recoiled. This was no accident. The broth's very existence was psychological warfare against weakness, against indulgence, against the human instinct to seek pleasure. Fast forward 2,000 years, and the echoes of this mentality reverberate in unlikely places. Take today's military Amori's meals ready to eat, designed not for taste but for caloric efficiency under duress. Like black broth, they prioritize function over flavor, packing dense nutrients into unappetizing packets that soldiers learn to choke down. The difference. While Spartans used their broth to cultivate disdain for luxury, modern armies engineer Amori's to sustain life in extremes: freeze-dried spaghetti that can survive Arctic winters or self-heating stews activated by chemical reactions. Both systems share a cold pragmatism: food as fuel stripped of sentiment. Then there's the superfood phenomenon. Spartan elders would have scoffed at chia puddings and kale smoothies, but the underlying ethos isn't so different. Just as black broth symbolized Spartan exceptionalism, we endure what you can't. Today's superfood trends often serve as badges of moral superiority. The Spartan who choked down his broth proved his worth to the phalanx. The modern yogi sipping seaweed shots signals enlightenment at a juice bar. Both diets thrive on scarcity psychology. The rarer and more unpleasant the ingredient, the greater the status. But here's the twist. Modern science reveals black broth may have been ahead of its time. The vinegar acted as a natural preservative and possibly boosted iron absorption from the blood, critical for warriors losing pints in battle. The pork fat provided slow-burning energy, while the absence of sugar prevented energy crashes. Compare that to today's keto or carnivore diets, where adherents swear by high-fat, low-carb regimens for mental clarity and endurance. The Spartans, it seems, stumbled onto a proto-warrior diet centuries before it became a hashtag. Yet the starkest parallel lies in the cult of deprivation. From Spartan mess halls to Silicon Valley biohackers fasting for cognitive optimization, the message is the same: suffering equals strength. But where Spartans used black broth to forge unbreakable soldiers, modern diet culture often veers into toxicity, orthorexia disguised as wellness. The broth was a means to an end. Today's extremes often become ends in themselves. Perhaps the most telling legacy of black broth isn't in what it contained, but what it rejected. In a world where Athenian feasts dripped with honey and figs, Sparta's bare-bones cuisine was a rebellion, a culinary middle finger to decadence. That spirit lives on in every minimalist meal plan, every fast undertaken in pursuit of purity. The vessels have changed, clay bowls swapped for stainless steel shakers, but the obsession remains: mastering hunger to master oneself. The question is, when does discipline become dogma? The Spartans never found that line. Will we? The rituals of fermented brews stretch far beyond the Andes, weaving through continents and cultures with a common thread: the belief that certain drinks could dissolve the boundary between mortal and divine. In the Amazon, where vines tangle into emerald cathedrals, shamans prepare ayahuasca under moonlight, its name literally meaning vine of the soul. Unlike chicha, this brew isn't born from chewing but from boiling bark and leaves, unlocking dimethyltryptamine, a compound so potent it rewires sensory perception. Tribes describe journeys to ancestral realms, where jaguar spirits impart wisdom and buried traumas surface like bubbles in a simmering pot. The parallels with Inca chicha rituals are striking. Both beverages served as conduits to the sacred, both demanded reverence in their making. Where Andean maidens fasted before chewing corn, Amazonian healers abstained from salt and sex, purifying themselves to handle the brew's power. Cross the globe to Tibet's wind-scoured plateaus, and you'll find Chang, a barley beer that fuels both festivals and meditation. Monks in mountain monasteries ferment it in wooden barrels, the yeast thriving in thin air where other brews would fail. During Losar, the Tibetan New Year, Chang is offered to deities before humans may drink, its frothy white bubbles symbolizing purity. Unlike ayahuasca's violent visions or chicha's communal warmth, Chang induces a gentle clarity ideal for long hours of prayer. Yet all three drinks share a sacred trinity: fermentation as alchemy, intoxication as enlightenment, and sharing as communion. What unites these traditions isn't just the act of drinking, but the theatricality surrounding it. An Inca lord sipping chicha from a golden Kiro cup, a Shipibo shaman serving ayahuasca in a painted gourd, a Tibetan lama passing a Chang-filled skull cup. Each vessel is a stage prop in the drama of transcendence. Even the side effects carry meaning: the purging caused by ayahuasca, purification, the mild drowsiness of Chang, a nod to the dreamlike nature of reality. Chicha's slight fizz, the breath of the earth itself. Modern science now glimpses why these brews resonated so deeply. Fermentation produces trace amounts of GABA, a neurotransmitter that eases anxiety, perfect for rituals requiring calm focus. The beta-carbolines in ayahuasca act as monoamine oxidase inhibitors, extending the potency of visionary compounds. These weren't just drinks, they were ancient neurochemistry stumbled upon through trial and reverence. Today, as chicha resurges in Peruvian hipster bars and ayahuasca retreats draw Silicon Valley elites, the line between sacrament and trend blurs. Yet in remote villages where elders still chant over bubbling vats, these brews remain what they've always been: not beverages, but bridges. Between people, between worlds, between the hunger of the body and the yearning of the soul. And perhaps that's the most intoxicating truth of all: that humanity's oldest drinks were never just about taste, but about touching the infinite with nothing more than a cup and the courage to sip. While Viking chieftains prized fermented whale tongue as a delicacy, their Arctic neighbors, the Inuit, perfected an even more audacious preservation technique. In the ice-locked villages of Greenland, where winter could last 10 months, survival hinged on a dish called caviar. Picture this: hundreds of tiny seabirds like auks or puffins, stuffed whole into a hollowed-out seal skin, feathers, beaks and all. The skin is sewn airtight with sinew, then buried under rocks for months, letting the relentless cold and pressure work their magic. What emerges isn't just food, it's a triumph of microbiology. The birds undergo anaerobic fermentation, their bones softening into edible mush while the seal fat permeates every fiber, creating something akin to pâté with a funky, cheesy punch. The Inuit didn't just tolerate this dish, they craved it, serving it raw at weddings and solstice feasts as a symbol of resilience. The science behind caviar is as ingenious as it is unsettling. Unlike typical rot that breeds deadly pathogens, Arctic fermentation exploits a unique quirk of cold climates, the absence of putrefactive bacteria. Instead, psychrophilic microbes, cold-loving organisms like certain strains of lactobacillus, dominate the process, producing lactic acid that preserves the meat while neutralizing toxins. It's the same principle behind kimchi or sauerkraut, but pushed to extremes. Modern lab tests reveal these fermented birds pack more vitamin C than citrus, a vital shield against scurvy in a land devoid of fresh produce. The seal skin acts as a natural pressure cooker, its oils imbuing the birds with omega-3s, while the bird's own enzymes break down muscle tissue into tender, spreadable meat. Yet caviar wasn't just about survival, it was ecology in action. Every part of the animal was used. The seal skin became a fermentation vessel, the bird bones turned to paste, even the fermented juices were drunk as a briny tonic. Compare this to Viking whale tongue, where only the elite consumed the prized organ while the rest of the carcass was doled out unevenly. Caviar, by contrast, was communal. A single seal skin could feed a family for weeks, its contents shared equally. The dish embodied the Inuit principle of ajoja, a belief that food tastes better when everyone partakes. The true test of caviar's legacy, it's still made today, not as a relic but as a living tradition. In Upernavik, elders teach children to monitor the fermentation by pressing the seal skin to check for gas buildup, a sign the microbes are active. Chefs in Copenhagen's Noma have even adapted the technique, using game birds and reindeer hide to create a haute cuisine version. But the soul of caviar remains unchanged, a reminder that what one culture dismisses as rot, another reveres as revelation. After all, the line between poison and delicacy has always been drawn not by nature, but by necessity and the courage to taste beyond first impressions. In Copenhagen's ultra-modern Noma, a dish arrives at the table that wouldn't have been out of place in a Roman emperor's villa, a single, glistening scallop resting in a pool of garum caramel. Across the globe, chefs are turning to ancient texts and archaeological digs for inspiration, reviving flavors once thought lost to history. But this isn't just culinary curiosity, it's a full-blown movement. At London's Black Axe Mangle, Chef Lee Tiernan ferments his own fish sauce using mackerel and sea salt, aged in repurposed whiskey barrels until it reaches the same eye-watering potency as Roman garum. In Slovenia, where edible dormice are still legally hunted, a pop-up feast recreates Elagabalus' infamous banquet, serving the rodents stuffed with spiced pork and drizzled with honey, though thankfully without the waste. Yet the most contentious revival might be happening in a Brooklyn test kitchen, where food scientists are attempting to clone Silphium. Using chemical analysis of ancient residues and DNA from its closest living relatives, they've engineered a paste that mimics its tangy, celery-like bite. When sprinkled over lamb chops at a recent tasting, guests described it as umami with a kick, though purists argue it's impossible to truly replicate a plant that interacted with a now extinct microbiome. The ethical debate rages. Is it respectful resurrection or culinary colonialism? Indigenous groups in North Africa, where Silphium once grew, question who profits from these experiments, while historians caution that context is lost when flavors are plucked from their cultural moorings and served as novelty. Then there's the sustainability question. When a Michelin-starred restaurant in Tokyo announced a limited-run Viking feast featuring fermented whale tongue sourced from Norway, protests erupted. Conservationists pointed out that while the dish might be historically accurate, its revival ignores the fragile state of modern whale populations. Contrast that with Lima's Central, where Chef Virgilio Martinez sources ahuatl, the Aztec insect caviar, from sustainable wetland farms, partnering with local harvesters to preserve both the ingredient and the ecosystem that produces it. The line between homage and harm grows blurrier with each experiment. What unites these chefs isn't just a fascination with the past, but a belief that these flavors have something to teach us. The Romans mastered fermentation without microscopes. The Inca brewed probiotic beer using human enzymes. In an age of lab-grown meat and climate-resistant crops, there's humility in realizing ancient cooks solved problems we're only now rediscovering. Yet the danger lies in treating these foods as trends rather than traditions. A dormouse can be a talking point, but for the Romans it was survival. Perhaps the true test of this revival isn't whether we can recreate these dishes, but whether we can honor the ingenuity behind them without reducing history to a garnish. What if the real shock isn't that ancient cultures ate dormice or blue lotus wine, but that we ever thought their tastes were strange to begin with? Every dish we've explored reveals the same truth. Necessity and creativity shaped these foods far more than mere eccentricity. The Roman who savored garum wasn't indulging in something grotesque. He was tasting globalization in a spoon, the oceanic tang of trade routes stretching from Spain to Egypt. The Inca maiden chewing corn for chicha wasn't performing a primitive ritual. She was a biochemist harnessing enzymes millennia before laboratories existed. These flavors weren't bizarre to them. They were brilliant solutions to the puzzles of their time. Now picture this: 500 years from now, historians might shudder at our own culinary quirks. Could they recoil at our obsession with neon orange cheese puffs, a food so processed it barely resembles its original ingredients? Will they gawk at avocado toast, wondering why we prized a fruit so fragile it required global supply chains to ripen? Our chicken nuggets, shaped into dinosaurs for childish whimsy, might seem as absurd to them as parrot pie does to us. The truth is, every era's diet carries the fingerprints of its technology, values, and blind spots. What feels normal today will inevitably become someone else's historical curiosity. Yet beneath the surface, these ancient foods whisper something universal. The Aztecs' insect caviar and the Vikings' fermented whale tongue both speak to humanity's relentless drive to transform scarcity into abundance, to find delight in the unexpected. That spark of ingenuity hasn't faded, it's just taken new forms. The next time you sprinkle nutritional yeast on popcorn or bite into a lab-grown burger, remember, you're part of the same story. So here's the real question: what forgotten flavors from your culture would make future historians pause? Maybe it's your grandmother's fermented cabbage, or that street food you love but can't describe without grimacing. Drop it in the comments. Let's marvel together at how delightfully weird our collective palate really is. After all, today's guilty pleasure might just be tomorrow's archaeological treasure.